In the last couple of lectures, we've been studying various types of deductive arguments. And in doing so, we've looked at a couple of very common argument forms, such as modus ponens and modus tollens. However, in ordinary English, we often encounter a wide variety of hypothetical arguments or disjunctive arguments or other kinds of deductive arguments that don't fit neatly within either one of these two particular forms. Let me give you a few examples to share with you what I'm talking about. So, for instance, take the following argument here. If there is a recession this year and a war breaks out, then the incumbent party will lose big in the midterm elections. The incumbent party isn't going to lose big, therefore war will not break out. Now, if we're looking at this argument right here, let's identify the form of the argument. And you can see, in looking at it, the antecedent in the first proposition actually contains a couple of different atomic propositions. First, there's a recession this year, and then we see here, and a war breaks out. So right off the bat, we have two different propositions. The first proposition is there is a recession. The second proposition, a war breaks out. And then we have another proposition here. The incumbent party will lose big in the midterm elections. Now, this is a new one, so we'll have to devise a different symbol for it. So I don't remember what I put on here, but it's going to be something like the following. If P and Q, then S. Sorry, I couldn't remember if I used S or R. But if P or Q, then S. Then we come down here. The incumbent party isn't going to lose big. Well, that's going to be not S. And then what is the conclusion here? Well, the war will not break out, so it's going to be not Q. Now, notice this isn't just a simple instance of modus tollens, because we're not denying the entire antecedent right here, or at least it's not obvious that we're doing that right away. It looks like the conclusion is just a part of the antecedent, because the antecedent of this is actually this entire compound statement right here. There is a recession and war breaks out. Remember, I said the antecedent is everything between if and the then. So it doesn't look, at least off at a first pass, that we've entirely denied the antecedent. As it turns out, the entire antecedent is false. And so when you're dealing with any statement that involves and, it's going to turn out that the components of and are also going to be false. But my point here is just that this is a little more complicated than just a simple modus tollens. Or let's look at another argument. If you are shot or your head is cut off, then your brain's activity will stop and you will die. Your brain's activity has not stopped, therefore you have not been shot. Well, this is actually a more complicated argument still. If we, again, try to symbolize this, we'll go through this, and it might be something, and it's not going to might, it is going to be something like this. If P or Q, then R and S. And then notice what we're saying here. P stands for you were shot. Your head is cut off. This is very morbid. It's going to be Q. R is standing for your brain's activity will stop, and S is standing for you will die. Then right here it says your brain activity is not stopped, so it's going to be not R. And then you were shot, well, that was P, so it's going to be not P. So again, this isn't just a simple instance of modus tollens either, because right here what we're denying is not the entire consequent. We're denying one of the parts of the consequent is true. We're not denying that the other part is true. So we have to ask, is this argument valid? And it's difficult to determine just from looking at some really complicated arguments whether or not they are. We lose our kind of intuitive sense of whether or not we have a valid inference. So in order to be able to determine in these more complicated arguments whether or not they are valid, we're going to have to study compound propositions in a whole lot more detail. And that's going to be the subject of today's lecture, or at least a part of it is going to be, it's going to be the start, I didn't mean to say a part. It's going to be the start of studying compound propositions in greater detail and going down the rabbit hole of propositional logic even more. Now, we've been talking about compound propositions for some time now. I have listed up here atomic statement and compound statement, but compound propositions are the same thing. And as I've said before, a compound proposition or compound statement is one that is made up using connectives. And when we talk about connectives, we're going to be focusing on a handful of different ones. We're going to be focusing on, in fact, 5 in particular connectives: and, or, not, if then, and if and only if. And an atomic statement, we can contrast that with a compound statement, is a statement that has no connectives whatsoever. So look at an example of an atomic statement. I ran to the theater. Now, as far as this goes, you notice you don't see the word and, you don't see the word or, not, if, then, or if and only if. Here's another one. I saw a movie. Again, it's an atomic statement. It is not made up of any kind of connectives. A compound statement is going to be, I ran to the theater and I saw a movie. Another one, I did not see a movie. This is also a compound statement because we do have one of our what we're calling connectives. The word not appears in here. Now, compound statements can be made up of other compound statements. For instance, I could say, I ran to the theater and I did not see a movie. Now notice, if I said that, I ran to the theater and I did not see a movie, on the one hand, we would have our atomic statement, which is I ran to the theater, but we'd be joining it with a compound statement, which is I did not see a movie. You can have compound statements that make up other compound statements, but the basic idea is that a compound statement is one that has a connective in it, whereas an atomic statement or atomic proposition is one that lacks a connective. Something else that's important to note about compound statements is that they are what we call truth functional. And what this means is that the truth value of an atomic statement, of a compound statement, is strictly and solely determined by the truth value of the atomic statements and, you might say, the connectives that constitute them. So if we're going to be looking at whether or not a particular compound statement is true or compound proposition is true, we determine whether or not it's true by determining what the truth value of the atomic propositions or atomic statements are. And let's just take a really simple example right here. John saw Mary and he gave her flowers. Oh, how sweet of John. But he saw Mary and he gave her flowers. Now notice that we have 2 atomic statements here. The first one is John saw Mary, and the second one is he gave her flowers. Now, if we have the question, when is this entire statement true? Under what condition would this entire, I don't know what that happened. Under what condition would this entire statement be true? When would this entire thing be true? Well, it's only going to be true if it is the case that this atomic proposition is true and this other one is true. But if either one of these is false, then this entire thing is going to be false. So the point here is that this compound proposition, its truth value is solely a function of the atomic propositions that make it up. And we can represent this on a chart, and you're actually going to start seeing a lot of these types of charts emerge. But this chart is what we're going to call a truth table, and I'm going to use a couple of simple ones today. And in the next video lecture, we're actually going to learn how to devise more complex truth tables. But in this one, what we're going to be doing is basically this truth table. We're going to have a atomic proposition here, an atomic proposition here, and then what's in the center, this represents the compound proposition, right? So let's just imagine a state of affairs in which both of the atomic propositions are true. So let's just say John saw Mary, and it's also true that he gave her flowers. Well, if that were the case, then the compound proposition would also be true. Now let's imagine another possible scenario in which John gave or saw Mary, but he didn't give her flowers. He was just being a jerk. He had them, but he gave them to Sarah. I don't know. Sarah was wearing a cuter dress that day. Who knows? But let's say John saw Mary, but he didn't give her flowers. Well, then this entire compound proposition, the compound proposition right here, it's not going to be true. The only time it's true is if both of these propositions, these atomic propositions, are true. Or what if, for instance, is a different state of affairs? Let's say John didn't see Mary, so it's false that he saw Mary, but he gave her flowers. Maybe he left them on her doorstep or something. Well, if that's the case, then it's just simply not true that he both saw her and gave her flowers. And finally, let's say he didn't see her and he didn't give her flowers. Well, then the compound proposition is also false. So you can see right here this way of representing how this compound proposition is true, but more importantly, you can see how the truth value of the compound proposition, and again, this right here represents the compound, this center column represents the entire truth value of the compound proposition, how it is strictly determined by the truth value of the component propositions. If both of these component propositions are true, then the compound proposition is true. However, if either one of the component propositions is false, then the entire compound proposition is itself false. And there are different truth tables that we can construct depending on the type of connective we're looking at. As I said, we have 5 different connectives. We have and, or, not, if, then, and if and only if. And the one we were just looking at is the connective and. And I want to spend just a second talking about that. It might be weird to say we're going to talk about the word and. But in logic, we call the word and conjunction. You might recall we talked about disjunctive propositions already. We've talked about hypothetical propositions. Well, we also can talk about conjunctive propositions. The way logicians use the word conjunction is a bit different than I think a lot of you are familiar with. Normally when you hear the word conjunction, you probably associate it with any type of phrase that joins two other propositions together, or even, not necessarily even propositions, but it could be objects or any kind of parts of a sentence. Like you might have the word or, the word but, the word and. All of these are conjunctions. However, that functions as a conjunction. But in logic, conjunction is used strictly for any for the word and. It is used strictly for the word and. And you might also recall when we talked about disjunction, we had the 2 parts of a disjunctive proposition. They were called disjuncts. Well, when we're talking about the different parts of a conjunctive proposition, or different parts of conjunction, we call those conjuncts. I know, these are very creative names. So in this case, P would be, P right here, this is one conjunct, and Q would be a different conjunct. And as I've represented it right here on our truth table, the only time the proposition P and Q, this compound proposition, is true, the only time it's true is when both conjuncts are true. In all other cases, no matter if P is true and Q is false, or if P is false and Q is true, or if they're both false, the compound conjunction is always going to be false. So this is conjunction. Like I said, the only time it's true is when both conjuncts are true. Now, I want to pause for a second and say a little bit about conjunction, as at least as it functions in logic. And what I wanted to say is, like with the hypothetical proposition, we often have non-standard ways of expressing conjunction. Typically, we do see it, and at least as I've expressed it so far, we've seen the word and we just use the word and to express conjunction. But the truth is in ordinary English, we can express conjunction in different ways. For instance, you might say, I want to go skydiving, but I have a sprained ankle. Now, I know the word but, as it functions in natural language, it has certain kind of connotations. But if you're stopping to think about it in just strictly logical terms, here we have 2 atomic propositions. The one is, I want to go skydiving, and the second one is, I have a sprained ankle. Now, here's a question. When is this entire compound proposition true? What if I want to go skydiving? Suppose that's true, and suppose I have a sprained ankle is true. Well, then clearly this entire thing is going to be true, this entire compound proposition. But what if one of the parts is false? What if it's not true that I want to go skydiving, but it is true I have a sprained ankle? Well, then the entire compound proposition is false. Or what if it's true that I want to go skydiving, but it's false that I have a sprained ankle? Well, then the entire compound proposition is false. What if neither one of these compound propositions, neither one is true? Well, then this entire thing is false. So you see here, even though I'm using the word but, from a strictly logical point of view, the word but functions in the exact same way as the word and does. Because the only time this entire compound proposition is true is when both of its conjuncts are true. That's the only time it's true. Here's another example, if it'll come up. Although steel rusts, it is often used in underwater construction. Here again we have two component propositions. Steel rust, it is often used in water construction. Now, when is this entire compound proposition true? The only time it's going to be true is when this proposition right here, steel rust, is true, and when this proposition is also true. If either one of these is false, or if both are false, then the entire compound proposition is going to be false. So you can see here it has the same truth conditions as a standard conjunction. The only time it's true is when both conjuncts are true. Or here's another one. Julie worked hard to pass the course. Nevertheless, she failed. That's really sad. But in this case, when is this true? Well, if you stop and you reflect on it, the only time it's true is when it's both the case that Julie worked hard and she failed. If she didn't work hard but she failed, then this entire proposition wouldn't be true. If she worked hard but she passed, then this entire proposition wouldn't be true. And if she didn't work hard and she didn't fail, well, again, then this entire proposition wouldn't be true. So these are non-standard ways of expressing and. I know, like I said, in ordinary English, something a little more is kind of communicated by words like although, nevertheless, but from a strictly logical point of view, because again, in logic, we're looking at the truth conditions for the various component propositions. From a strictly logical point of view, the only time these compound propositions are true is if both component propositions are. They're false in all other occasions, and for that reason, these are actually different ways of expressing conjunction. That's all they are when you get right down to it, logically speaking. So this is conjunction. It's true only when both conjuncts are true. Now, another compound proposition we've seen so far is negation. And negation is pretty simply, it's true only when the atomic proposition that composes it is false. So the only time negation is true, it's kind of like in math, it's true only when it's false, or a compound proposition is true only when it's false. So I did not go to the store. When is this true? Well, it's true just in case it's false. Let me back up a second. I did not go to the store. Here's an example. So what is the component proposition here? Well, the atomic proposition is I did go to the store. That's the atomic proposition. So when would this compound proposition, I did not go to the store, be true? Well, just in case the atomic proposition, I did go to the store, is false. Or if I said it this way, it is false I went to the store. What is the atomic proposition? Well, the atomic proposition is again, these are all I went to the store. I should have gotten some more creative ones. This again is true only if the atomic proposition, which is I went to the store, is false. Here again, this is just another way of saying this same thing. I did not go to the store. I could say it is not the case I went to the store. Again, it's only true when the atomic proposition, in this case the atomic proposition would be I went to the store. The only time this compound proposition is true is just in case it is false that I went to the store. Now, that might be a very confusing thing to say, but again, just like with conjunction, we can represent this on a truth table. So if you were to go back to this, if I were to take this statement right here, I did not go to the store, and I put this on the truth table, well, then I can put the atomic proposition here, I went to the store, and I use the word not here, and not represents the compound proposition, I did not go to the store, right? And so suppose it's true that I went to the store. Well, then if that's the case, then it's going to be false. Then the compound proposition, I did not go to the store, would be false. I know this sounds kind of confusing, and maybe it's funny, as simple as negation is often the most difficult to talk about. But basically, a compound proposition that involves negation, the only time it's true is when the atomic proposition or the component proposition that makes it up is false. So if it's true that I went to the store, then it's just simply false that I didn't go to the store. And I feel like I'm overcomplicating something here, but suppose that it's false that I went to the store. Well, then it would be true that I did not go to the store. So basically, when you're dealing with negation, what you do is the compound proposition that's made up using negation, which is what we're seeing right here in the left-hand column, that's only true when the component proposition is false. And if ever the component proposition is true, then the compound proposition involving negation is going to be false. So whenever you see negation, you just always, it's the truth value of the compound proposition using negation is always the opposite of the component proposition that makes it up. Hopefully that'll become clear what I mean by that as time rolls along. But another connective is disjunction, and this is one we've seen already, and we've talked about it a little bit so far. But disjunction, there are various examples of it, but like I say up here, it is true if at least one disjunct is true, and is false only when both disjuncts are false. So this is because, and I explained this in a previous lecture about the inclusive or. And if you recall, an inclusive or is just basically the way the word or functions in natural language. It can mean P or Q or both P and Q. So we can represent this on our truth table. And let's say we have a compound proposition. Sarah will come or Pete will come. If both of these compound propositions are true, well then the compound proposition involving or is going to be true. Well, what if one is true and the other is false? Well, then it's still true. Well, what if the first one, Sarah will come, is false, or Pete will come? Well, then it's still true. What if both are false? Well, that's the only case in which the compound proposition is going to be false. So this one, again, when we're dealing with disjunction, as long as one of the two disjuncts is true, as long as one is true, the entire disjunction is going to be true. Next, we've talked about this one before, but this one is probably going to be, honestly, the most annoying for a lot of you. If you thought negation was kind of tricky to talk about, this one is going to be a little bit confusing. We've talked about hypothetical propositions in the past, and we've talked about how there are these non-standard ways of expressing them, where we use like only if or unless. But when we're talking about the truth status of hypothetical propositions, this is what's interesting, is that it's the only time a hypothetical proposition is true is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So let's represent this on our truth table here, and maybe I should have picked a higher sum. I say you give me $5. If you give me $5, then I'll be happy. Maybe what I should have said is if you give me $5 million. Let's go with that. If you give me $5 million, I will be happy. Well, suppose you do in fact give me $5 million, and it's also true that I'm happy. Well, then this hypothetical, if you give me $5 million, then I'll be happy. Well, that's true. But let's suppose you give me $5 million and I'm not happy. Well, if that's the case, you give me $5 million and I'm still just as miserable as I currently am. Actually, I'm really happy. But anyways, let's suppose that you give me $5 million, but it doesn't make me happy. Well, if that's the case, then this entire proposition, if you give me $5 million, then I'll be happy, that just wasn't true. Because giving me the money didn't do anything for me. So, but what if you never give me any money? But I'm still nonetheless happy. What then of the truth value of if you give me of the entire compound proposition? If you give me $5 million, then I'll be happy. Well, guess what? It's still going to be true. This is one that's kind of confusing for students because they're like, wait, why would the entire if-then statement be true if the antecedent is false? And the reason it is because, and this is why one's kind of tricky to talk about, is because when we deal with the if-then statement, which, I'm sorry, I've glossed over something. Sometimes this is also called a conditional. hypothetical statement. It's also called conditional. But when we're dealing with a conditional or hypothetical statement, notice we're not dealing with actualities. We're dealing with hypothetical possibilities, right? So, and when you're dealing with hypothetical possibilities, well, yeah, if I got 5 million, or if you gave me 5 million, yeah, I would be happy, but just because you didn't give me 5 million, and, I mean, let me back up a second. It's still true that if you were to give me this money, I would be happy. Now, you never gave me the money, and I'm still happy. But it would be true if you gave me the money, I would still be happy. I didn't explain that extremely well. Basically, my point here, and I'm not doing a good job explaining this, is that the hypothetical proposition is still going to be true, even if in reality, you never give me money. It's still going to be true that the money would make me happy, even though you've never given it to me. So the hypothetical proposition remains true, even though the antecedent never materializes. In the real world, I never get the 5 million, right? In the real world, I never get it. But it's still true that the money would make me happy, even though I never actually get it. By the way, if I actually did get it, this class would be cut short because I wouldn't be coming into work tomorrow. I should just mention that, by the way. I'd be living high on the hog from here on out. But getting back to the lecture here, so the point here is the hypothetical proposition is still true, despite the fact that the antecedent never actually occurs. Despite the fact that I never get the 5 million, it's still true that it would make me really freaking happy. And the same thing actually is going to be the case when we look at if both the antecedent is false, and the consequent is false. Suppose that you never give me $5 million, and suppose I'm really unhappy. It's still true that if you gave me the 5 million, I would be happy. It's just in actuality, you don't give me the 5 million, and in actuality, I'm not happy, but it's still nonetheless true. This is why this is so difficult to talk about, because we're dealing with hypothetical possibilities here, right? When we deal with an if-then statement, we're dealing merely with possibilities. So the only scenario that actually invalidates the if-then is if you were to actually give me the 5 million and I was miserable, I wasn't happy, that's the only set of circumstances that could arise that would actually invalidate that hypothetical statement, because then we would have proof. It's like, well, look, I gave you 5 million, you're still miserable. So it's just clear proof that the statement, if you give me 5 million, I will be happy, that statement is false. All the other statements, or all the other possible scenarios, it's true, I get the 5 million, it's true, I'm happy, or, it's false over here, or it's true and false here. All these others leave it wide open that the hypothetical could still be true. The only scenario that invalidates this hypothetical if-then is if you actually give me the money and it turns out I'm still false. So if that doesn't make sense, just memorize this right here. It's going to be important that you learn these truth tables, by the way. Biconditional, if and only if. Now, we've talked about biconditional for a little while now. I don't think I've used this name, but the name makes a lot of sense if you stop and think about it. We call the hypothetical proposition the if P then Q. We also called it conditional. A biconditional, however, what you're saying is if P then Q and if Q then P. So it's bi. The arrow goes both ways, so to speak. And this is true only if both conditional statements, or only if both component propositions are true, or when both conditional or both component propositions are false. We use this kind of language quite often. You might say, you die if and only if your brain activity stops. And basically what this is telling us is that these two component propositions, their truth value, in order for this compound proposition to be true, these two, their truth values, they co-vary with one another. They coincide with one another. Same with the second proposition. And we can represent this on our chart and maybe make a little more sense. But if both of these component propositions are true, then the compound statement is also true. However, if one of the first is true and the second is false, then the compound proposition is false. Same thing, if the first one is false and the second is true, then the compound proposition is false. However, if both of them are false, then as it turns out, the compound proposition is true. So this is one, again, like I said, the truth value of the, when we're talking about an if and only if, the truth value of the component propositions, if both of them have the same truth value, then the compound proposition will be true. If either one of them has a different truth value from the other, if one is true and the other is false, then this compound proposition is also going to be false. So those are 5 connectives, and we're going to be using those quite extensively. Now, one thing we have to talk about with regard to the connectives and figuring out the truth value of compound propositions is that how we group the component propositions determines the truth value of the compound proposition they make up. Because we can group, it's just like, in math actually, or it's very similar to in math, how you can group multiplication, or you can group addition or subtraction. You have an order of operations you have to follow, so to speak. Something similar affects propositions, and how we group them can determine whether or not a certain compound proposition is true. And I want to give you an example of this, actually a couple of examples of this, but suppose I said the following. I will get ice cream and pie or cake. I will get ice cream and pie or cake. Now, as it's stated, this is actually ambiguous, and whether or not this proposition is true, or let me rephrase that, the truth conditions for this proposition determined by how we group the connectives that make and the component propositions that make it up. Now, one thing you might be saying here is, I will get ice cream and I will get pie or I will get cake. But another thing you might be saying is something different, which is, I will get ice cream and I will get pie or I will get cake. Now, what's the difference between these two? Stop and think about that. What's the difference between these two? Well, the first proposition, what you're saying is basically, I will get ice cream and I will get pie or cake. So in the first one is you're basically saying, look, I'm getting ice cream, right? This is what's happening here, people. I'm getting ice cream. The only question is, am I going to be eating it with pie, or am I going to be eating it with cake? Or truthfully, with inclusive or, I might be eating it with both, right? But I'm getting ice cream, right? And I just don't know what I'm going to pair it with, so to speak. Will it be paired with pie? Will it be paired with cake? I'm getting ice cream and I will get pie or I will get cake. The second one, though, I'm saying something different. The second one I'm saying, on the one hand, I'm getting ice cream and pie. On the other hand, I might be just getting cake, right? Now, I know we could throw in the inclusive or, and it could be a set of circumstances here where even in the second sentence you end up with both, but let's just ignore that for a second. There are different set of circumstances that will make proposition 1 true from proposition 2. And proposition 1, you're getting ice cream, and you're going to end up also with either pie or cake. So you're going to be eating, in this one you could be eating ice cream with your cake. But down here, pie and ice cream are going together, and you're going to be, on the one hand, eating pie or ice cream, or on the other hand, you're going to be eating cake. So, depending on how we group these component propositions with these connectives affects the truth value of this compound proposition here. Let me give you another example. Sarah and John are not going. This is also ambiguous, and this is going to be affected by how we group our connectives. Now, in this one, we have 2 connectives. We have and, we also have the word not. And we could be saying 2 different things. On the one hand, you might be saying something like, Sarah is not going and John is not going. Or you might be saying both Sarah and John are not going. So what are we saying here? What's different that's being said? Well, basically in this statement right here, in the statement number 1, you're saying that Sarah is not going and John is not going. And the only time this first statement is going to be true is if neither one of them goes. If Sarah ends up going without John, or John ends up going without Sarah, then statement number 1 right here is going to be false. But notice that's not true in statement number 2. The statement number 2 is just saying both of them aren't going. And that could be true if Sarah goes and John doesn't go. It could be true if John goes and Sarah doesn't go. Or it could be true if neither one of them end up going. So depending on how we group the connectives and how we group the atomic propositions that compose this compound proposition affects the truth value of the entire compound proposition. And this is something we're going to be looking at. And I know this might seem like a really nitpicky thing, but believe it or not, actually some really interesting legal and constitutional, believe it or not, constitutional issues hang on this type of grouping. Now, as we look at this, it can be a little cumbersome to always actually write out the word and, to write out if and only if, to write out not. And so logicians have actually devised an entire system of symbols. We haven't gotten this abstract yet, but we're going to start using these certain symbols to represent our connectives. We're going to have a symbol for each one, for and, for not, for if and only if, and for if then. And the reason for doing this is, believe it or not, it's going to be something new for you to learn, and I know something new is always a bit of a challenge, but in the long run it's going to simplify our ability to talk about these groupings. It's going to simplify our ability to conduct and perform logical operations. I know it's going to be a pain in the neck to learn it up front, but believe it, you're just going to have to trust me. It is going to help clarify certain things that would otherwise be very complicated. But the symbols I have listed right here for you, they're also in your book as well. But for each of these connectives, we're going to have a symbol to represent it. For the word and, we're just going to use a dot. You know, the way I learned it, we actually had an upside down V, so to speak, but your book uses a dot. Dot is used in some logic books, and upside down V is used in others. But if we're representing P and Q, this is how we do it right here. We just put P dot Q. That's what it means. Negation, we use what's this symbol here called a tilde, and it's just, if you're saying not P, this is how we do it. Disjunction, we use this to represent or, this V right here, P or Q. Conditional, if then, we use a horseshoe. The way I learned it was you use a sideways arrow, but your book uses the horseshoe. Some books use horseshoe, some use arrow, same thing, but we represent it this way. If P then Q, this is how we say if P then Q. And if and only if, we use these three lines like this. I learned it was an arrow that went both directions, but one way to do if and only if is this sideways, these three lines as such. And like I said, this is actually in the long run going to help simplify our ability to perform logical operations and discuss various truth conditions for compound propositions. So I want to just spend a little time trying to translate some ordinary sentences into symbols, and this is actually going to be what your homework is on. What you're going to be asked to do is translate some ordinary sentences into English. But suppose you have something like this: you can't hide your lying eyes. How would you translate this into symbols using the ones I just presented to you? Well, it's going to be very similar to what you've done thus far. You're going to say not P. You have to identify your atomic proposition. Here, your atomic proposition is going to be you can hide your lying eyes, and you're going to say not P. Only difference is, instead of writing out the word not, you just use a little tilde mark. All right, that's how you do it. Well, what about something like this? Hillary and Sarah are going to see Arrival. Well, it's going to be very similar to what you've done thus far. You have to identify your component propositions, which are Hillary is going to see Arrival, Sarah is going to see Arrival, and then you just use a symbol, the dot, to represent this, which would be P dot Q. And here P represents Hillary is going to see Arrival, Q represents Sarah is going to see Arrival. How about this? If you take Pete, then Sarah will go crazy. Well, just like what you've been doing thus far, you identify your atomic propositions, and then you just use the sideways horseshoe to represent. If P, then Q. I can play guitar, drums, or bass. Well, how do we do this one? Well, we just use a different letter to represent each atomic proposition. And it's going to be like this: P or Q or R. You could use any letters you want. You could have, maybe this would have made it easier, use G, D, and, oh, that's a bad word, don't say that, and B, and then you just do it like this right here. Don't worry about groupings for this one right here. We'll worry about those. Actually, we'll worry about those on the next slide. But this is how you would symbolize these. I know it looks kind of crazy at first, but you're doing exactly what you've been doing all along. It's only instead of writing out the word or, you just use this. Instead of writing out if then, you use that. But it's the exact same thing you've done on the previous exercises. Well, let's do a couple more complicated translations, because honestly, I'm a bit of a nerd. I find this to be kind of fun. So what if I said you can't hide your lying eyes and you're a coward? How would you represent this symbolically? Well, notice here we have a couple of connectives. We have can't. We also have and. So what are our atomic propositions? Well, one is you can hide your lying eyes. So we're going to say not P. The other one is going to be you're a coward, which is an atomic proposition we represent with Q. So we just say it like this, not P and Q. That's how we would do this one. What about I can't play drums or I can't play guitar? Oh, I said that backwards, sorry. I can't play guitar or I can't play drums. Well, here's how we'd represent this symbolically. Again, what you're saying is not P or not Q. Here's what you're saying here. How about this one? I can't play guitar or drums. Now this one's a little bit different. What are you saying here? It's ambiguous, but I think probably what is being indicated here is this. It's not the case that I can play guitar or drums. Now, you might wonder, well, what's the difference in these two right here? But you see how the symbols, if somebody just said I can't play guitar or drums versus someone said I can't play guitar or, let me back up, my mouth was moving faster than my brain. If someone said I can't play guitar or I can't play drums versus someone said I can't play guitar or drums, it might be a little confusing just hearing that, what exactly they're saying. But here is a case in point. I think we're using the symbols makes it clearer what's being said. Now we'll come to it, we'll talk about this next class, what exactly the truth conditions are that are different here. But basically what this one is saying is it's significantly different than this one right here. What this one is saying up here is like, basically, I can't do one or I can't do the other. This one down here is telling you I can't play either, right? It's like, I can't, this one down here, what this is saying is, basically, I can't play drums and I can't play guitar. This one, the first one, however, is just saying I can't do one or the other, all right? Sarah is not going and John is not going. This is how we would represent this. Not P and not Q. Like I said, you can use any letters you want here, but we have to figure out our atomic propositions. Our atomic proposition is Sarah is going. Our other atomic proposition is John is going, and then we just negate those. Not P and not Q. Well, what if you said both Sarah and John are not going? This is how we'd represent that. And notice here, remember I said that the only time that a conjunction is true is if both of the conjuncts are true. And so this one was true only if both are true. But then we're saying that's false, right? This is what the not means. So the only time this entire, let me use my little thing here. The only time this right here is true is if both P is true and both Q is true. But now we're saying false to this. So the only time this is going to be true is if both of these are false, right? And that's what I was saying a second ago. There's a big difference between these two statements right here. And it's made, I think, a lot more visually clear by using these symbols here. We can just represent it so much more clearly, or at least it's clearer to me. And I hope it will be to you once you do a little bit more of this. All right? One or a couple more. Oh, shoot, got ahead of myself. Well, it's coming up and I can't stop it. But Hillary and Sarah are going to see Arrival, or they are going to see Doctor Strange. And here again, we have a very complex proposition that's going on. Hillary and Sarah are going to see Arrival, or Hillary is going to see Doctor Strange and Sarah is going to see Doctor Strange. So, how we group these propositions really affects the truth of this compound proposition here. If you don't take Pete, then either Sarah will go crazy or she will not come home. Notice all the connectives we have here. Don't, so we have negative here. We have if then, we have or, disjunction, and then we have again a negation here. If so, how will we represent this? It's going to be kind of crazy, but like this: if not P, then Q, or not R. One final one. Unless you can play guitar, drums, or bass, you can't be in the band. Wow, we're putting a whole lot of them together now. Because notice we have unless, we have or, we have negative here. So what are we saying? It's like if you can't play drums or bass, then you can't be in the band. Or we could say it like this: not P or Q or R, or I should say if not P or Q or R, then not, and I use B to represent band here. So this is really fun, huh? I bet a lot of you are just so glad you signed up and I saved this for the end of the semester. It's like probably nothing more you'd rather be doing with your day than translating these statements into symbolic form. So guess what? There's some really good news for you guys, some light at the end of the tunnel. And that is you get to do something for homework. Yay! It says in-class practice up here. Well, we're not in class, so this is going to be your homework. But for homework, do these problems right here on page 280, 281. And basically, you're going to be given some ordinary English sentences. Make sure you do it 9.2b. Don't do A. We're not going to worry about A just yet. And what you're going to be doing is translating these into symbolic form. So you can use whatever letters you want to do this, but if for some people they like just using P and Q and they don't really care. Some people like to use letters that better represent the propositions, like if you say John is going and Sarah are going. Some people like to use J for John and S for Sarah. I don't really care. The letters are not as important as that you correctly identify the atomic proposition and that you can use the symbols to represent them. But I do want you to put these propositions that you're given, these compound statements, into symbolic form using the dot or the tilde or the horseshoe or the V or whatever. So that's going to be your homework. If you have questions about this, please email me.